So the title here is, do we need trade unions or are we better off without? And I'm going to deal with this topic purely from the point of view of expediency, namely whether unions are a good thing or a bad thing from the point of view of efficiency. I'm going to leave the normative side without, but that's only because I'm an empirical social scientist, not because I think that the normative arguments for whether we need unions or not are not relevant. They're extremely relevant, but I feel better qualified to deal with the empirical slash efficiency side. So I want to start, if I succeed, this is going to be highly risky, by showing a short video, and I don't know whether this is going to work, but let me try. No, it doesn't work. No. By the way, you can also ask questions in French. That's the one language I have learned. German I haven't learned yet, but I'm trying. Okay. Yeah. So,
when unions get higher wages for their members by restricting entry into an occupation, those higher wages are at the expense of other workers who find their opportunities reduced. When government pays its employees higher wages, those higher wages are at the expense of the taxpayer. But when workers get higher wages and more civilized working conditions through the free market, when they get them by firms competing with one another for the best workers, by workers competing with one another for the best jobs, those higher wages are at nobody's expense. They can only come from higher productivity, greater capital investment, more widely diffused skills. The whole pie is bigger. There's more for the worker, but there's also more for the employer, the investor, the consumer, and even the taxpayer. That's the way a free market system distributes the fruits of economic progress among all the people. That's the essence of the age of the worker.
all right, so if you thought that this guy is a charlatan, you're wrong. This is Milton Friedman, as you probably have recognized, and this is the series Free to Choose, which is a series that was aired in 1980 in the United States. Milton Friedman was one of the very first intellectuals to understand that there was a need to go out there and educate the public about what a free market means. And a free market means, first and foremost, among other things, for Milton Friedman, getting rid of the unions. They're not just inefficient, they are a positive contribution to inequality. We heard what he said. Trade unions are a monopoly of the labor supply. They increase wages, the price of labor beyond the market price. By doing that, they create an excess of supply. More workers want to work at the going wage rate, which is higher than the market price, but firms want to employ fewer workers. The result is unemployment, but there's worse than that. In order to make sure that those few union jobs go to union members, they will have to actively restrict the access of other workers to those jobs. So those jobs, those workers will have to go into the non-union sector where they will increase the supply and lower the wages of non-union jobs below the market wage. So unions not just create inefficiency by manipulating the market price, they also contribute positively to inequality. They make the more skilled workers richer at the expense of everyone else. And that is a quote that I have there from another book of Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom of 1962. Which I have to teach about tomorrow, by the way, in my doctoral seminar. Let's read If unions raise wage rates in a particular occupation or industry, they necessarily make the amount of employment available in that occupation or industry less than it otherwise would be, just as any higher price cuts down the amount purchased. The effect is an increased number of persons seeking other jobs, which forces down wages in other occupations. Since unions have generally been strongest among groups that would have been high paid anyway, their effect has been to make high paid workers higher paid at the expense of lower paid workers. Another general argument against unions is an argument that is developed by several authors, but most notably perhaps by von Hayek in 1980. Unions interfere with the mechanisms of competition. In particular, they interfere with the key mechanism, which is the price signaling, the signals that the price system emits. By doing so, they reduce productivity. So, by interfering with the free allocation of the spontaneous allocation of markets, they reduce the label today is the growth potential of the economy, i.e., they reduce productivity. One of the ways in which unions interfere with the mechanisms of economic competition is by keeping inefficient jobs alive. A company should go out of business but is kept up by union opposition, or by pushing for higher public sector wages. Now, these are very old arguments. They date from the 60s, the 70s, but recently there is a variant of this argument, and this variant is actually more modern, and that's the so-called insiders versus outsiders dichotomy. The first model of this type is by a Swedish economist and an American economist, Lindbeck and Snower. The idea here is an old one. You've seen it already in Friedman. Unions do good just for the insiders, i.e. for mature male workers that have regular contracts. They do well for them by erecting barriers to entry, by preventing other workers that would be qualified to work for insider jobs, preventing them from entry into these jobs. These workers end up into a secondary market characterized by more precarious conditions and lower wages. Now, this dichotomy between insiders and outsiders has inspired a spate of labor market reforms in European countries, from Spain to Italy to Germany and currently to France. The rhetoric behind labor market reforms or pension reforms in France is that you need to rebalance the playing field between the insiders that have too many protections and the outsiders that don't have enough. These are the arguments. And in briefly summarizing the arguments, I will not talk about other types of arguments. There is an argument against unions that has to do with democratic legitimacy. So let me just say a few words about this argument. There is a body politic that expresses a collective will by electing a president. No names will be named. And the president has been elected by committing to pass a pension reform. So he has a democratic mandate to pass this pension reform. And then these forces, these unelected forces, we don't know how representative they are, they stand in the way. They block this reform through mobilization, through strikes, through other forms of boycotts. That's democratically illegitimate. So there are various types of arguments against trade unions, and we need to take them seriously. The way I'm going to take some of them seriously is by looking at the empirical evidence. So I'm going to start by looking at the literature on the relationship between unions and the economic efficiency at the macro level, at the macroeconomic level. I'm going to look at things like, is there a relationship between unions and unemployment? Is there a relationship between unions and inflation? Now, this literature is very old. And I think it's a fair summary. We'll hear what the discussant has to say. The fair summary is that it's a literature that is all over the place. You find any type of results depending on how many countries you consider, what time frame you consider, and what variables you consider both as dependent variables and independent variables. If you were to run a simple correlation between, say, the inflation rate and a measure of union strength, which is the union density rate, the percentage of workers, of dependent employees who are represented by unions over the total number of dependent employees, you would probably find a positive, unconditional correlation. The stronger the unions, the higher the union density rate, the higher the inflation rate. In the 70s and in the 80s, when inflation was a problem. I don't think that correlation exists anymore. But even there, the relationship between unions and inflation is highly contingent. Is contingent on lots of things, and in particular, it's contingent on the type of unions and the type of collective bargaining system. So if unions are, the word was encompassing, if they represent a large share of workers, then they internalize the externalities of their action, which means that they know that inflation can be a bad thing, and therefore they spontaneously moderate their wage demands. So the relationship between union strength and inflation actually turns down as unions become highly representative, which is the case in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. With regard to the relationship between unions and unemployment, I think it's fair to say that the opposite relationship was found, at least until the 1980s, i.e., the stronger the unions, the lower the unemployment rate if the collective bargaining system is centralized, i.e., if negotiations between unions, employers, and the state take place at the national level. Again, this is a matter for internalization of externalities. Unions that negotiate at the top level, at the national level, internalize the externalities of wage militancy more than small sectional unions. There was a large literature on so-called corporatist policy making. This is a literature that looked at public policy as formulated by unions, employers, and governments in so-called tripartite pacts. And that literature essentially said that strong unions in centralized collective bargaining system provide for a better trade-off between inflation and unemployment, i.e., they can reduce the rate of unemployment for given levels of inflation. Although, as I said, this literature is highly variable in its results. For example, what I just said about unemployment no longer applies to the 90s and 2000. I think it's fair to say that the macro evidence just does not back up the thesis of Friedman or Hayek that strong unions lead to negative efficiency consequences. There is a more micro-oriented literature that looked at rather than comparing countries, compared different plans. And this literature has interesting conclusions. The classic piece here is a book by Friedman and Madoff in 1984. It's called What Do Unions Do? And it's based on individual level data. Essentially, and these are by no means heterodox economists. These are straight mainstream economists, both teaching at Harvard. So they essentially say that there are two phases of unions. One is the monopoly phase, the one Milton Friedman talks about. This is a monopoly of labor supply that increases the wages above market levels, and that has inefficiencies. But then there is another phase of unions, that's the voice. By providing workers with a voice, they introduce a mechanism by which tacit knowledge about how to improve working conditions is transferred from workers to management, such that productivity is increasing. So you have two effects. On the one hand, wages go up. On the other hand, labor productivity also goes up, which means that unit labor costs, which are wages divided by labor productivity, don't necessarily increase. In other words, unions make firms, according to Friedman and Madoff, more productive, but also they increase their costs. Overall, union workplaces are not less efficient than non-union places. And then there is another literature that I want to mention here, which this is mostly heterodox literature, looks at the positive effects of labor rigidities, i.e. not just strong unions, but labor institutions on labor productivity. And these effects go under the name of Marx-Hicks effects. I think the received wisdom in the policy discourse is that if you want to increase labor productivity, you have to reduce rigidities. Weaken unions, weaken employment protection, and so on and so forth. But if you look at things in a dynamic perspective, that would be the wrong conclusion. In fact, the empirical literature shows that if you reduce rigidities, if you lower rigidities, rather than increasing labor productivity, you decrease it. Why is that the case? For the following reasons. If unions increase wages for a given price of capital, that means that labor becomes more expensive than capital, i.e. the employer has an incentive to replace labor with capital, which means that the existing job, the remaining jobs, have a higher capital intensity, i.e. they are more productive. But there's also a risk of technological unemployment. Second, unions rule out certain management practices. It's no longer possible, if unions are strong enough, for firms to compete on cost minimization. They have to compete on other things, on human capital, on investing in workers, on the ability to innovate. Overall, there seems to be fairly robust evidence for various countries that there is a positive correlation between labor rigidities, and among the labor rigidities there are strong unions, and labor productivity. Vice versa. If you eliminate labor rigidities, labor productivity goes down, which is a trend which is going on at this point in time. Labor productivity is declining. Overall, there is no evidence that unions reduce productivity, and there is even some evidence, as well as theoretical arguments, that unions increase productivity. Let's now move to unions and inequality. And here, the evidence is much more univocal. Whereas before the evidence was all over the place, here we have clear conclusions. The statement by Friedman and others that unions increase wage inequality is completely wrong. There is a robust association between unions and inequality. The stronger the unions, the lower the inequality. However you want to measure that inequality, as wage inequality, income inequality. And however, whatever type of income you focus on. Functional income versus household income, and so on and so forth. Now, I have to say one thing. The evidence is very clear when you compare across countries. When you compare a strong union country like, say, Sweden with a weak union country like the US, and you make that comparison for 22, 23 countries, then you, at a cross-sectional level, you see a very strong correlation. If you focus on so-called within comparisons, i.e. whether within a country increasing union strength reduces inequality and reducing union strength increases inequality, then the evidence becomes much weaker. And there are various reasons why it becomes weaker. One is that the composition of unions may change over time. So as time goes, for equal levels of union strength, union becomes less interested in equalizing wages. Why? Because they mostly represent workers with strong labor market conditions. And there is some evidence that that is the case. It is also possible that for equal levels of union strength, unions simply cannot redistribute because markets become more competitive. And there is a third, more technical argument that by doing this kind of comparisons, measurement error becomes bigger. And so it's more difficult to appreciate any effect. One literature which is relatively recent and which I find really interesting is a literature that looks at the relationship between union strength and top inequality. So not wage inequality, but, for example, the capital share of, or the income share of the top 1%. And this literature finds a very strong association between top inequality and union strength. Countries with strong unions tend to have lower top-end inequality. How is that possible? That's surprising, because whereas unions determine the wages and working conditions of regular workers, they certainly do not determine the incomes of the top 1%, which are, have non-union jobs, and most of their income doesn't depend on labor income, it depends on capital income. But that's exactly the point. One way to explain that phenomenon, that result, is that strong unions reduce the share of income, of national income, going to capital as opposed to labor. Because capital tends to be highly unequally distributed. In countries, normally only 5%, sometimes 10% of households have any financial assets, which is where capital incomes come from. And because unions reduce the share going to this 5 to 10% of the population, they reduce the top shares of income. Another mechanism is that, and this is, I think, applicable to Germany, is that strong unions sit on boards of companies. By sitting on the board of companies, they directly interfere with the determination of executive pay, or used to interfere with the determination of executive pay. Another mechanism is through public policy. In countries with strong unions, it's simply more difficult to pass public policy that benefits primarily the top 1%. One thing that these two authors find, Jomot and Osorio, and interestingly, these are IMF economists, that it is coming from the mainstream of policy making, is that for given levels of inequality generated by the market, countries with strong unions have more redistribution through the fiscal and transfer system, which is clearly a political effect. Another strong, robust finding is that unions reduce the share of national income going to capital and increase the share of national income going to labor. They increase the wage share of GDP. Let me show you some figures. So here you have union density on the horizontal axis and the labor share, the share of income that goes to workers and self-employed whose incomes are treated as labor income. And this is being done for different groups of countries, liberal countries, these are the Anglo-Saxon countries, continental countries, includes Germany, the Nordic countries are the Scandinavians plus Finland, Mediterranean countries, and Central and Eastern European countries. Well, these are union density residuals, which means that this is not a bivariate relationship. We are controlling for country and time fixed effects. And the relationship is a positive one. The stronger is the union controlling for country effects and time effects, the higher the labor share. When the relationship is not the same everywhere, but it's positive everywhere. It's especially strong in liberal countries and continental countries. Let me show you this relationship for some of these countries. This is Germany. The red line is union density, the blue line is the wage share. It's not perfect, okay? The correlation coefficient is 0.8. And there is this blip in the wage share in the early 2000s. We will see it again. But overall, and this is going to become clearer with other countries, take Italy, for example. The two series, although they are too short for a proper test, they seem to move in tandem. They seem to share a time trend. The way I interpret this, and of course it's a subjective interpretation, is that as union strength declines, the wage share also declines. It's much more difficult to interpret it the other way, because union density is an institutional fact. This is Sweden. The relationship is weaker, and again you find the blip in the wage share. This is the UK, which looks like the US. This is France, and the relationship is almost perfect. As union density declines, the wage share declines. And this is the US, again the blip. Overall, and this is interesting, as unions become weaker, the share of national income going to workers goes down. So let me summarize this part. There are very strong arguments that have been made about the undesirable effects of unions on efficiency and equity. Unions contribute to reduce efficiency, and are also a force that increases inequality in society, but they're not backed up by evidence. The macroeconomic evidence, the evidence on macroeconomic outcomes, tells us that the effect of unions is mixed and highly contingent on the type of unions and the type of collective bargaining, but overall, there is no ground to say that unions contribute to inefficiency. And there is fairly strong evidence, at least cross-sectional, that with regard to inequality, weak unions tend to be associated with higher inequality, and particularly higher top-end inequality. Therefore, sometimes you will hear people like Robert Reich or Joe Stiglitz arguing that one solution to the problem of inequality is strengthening again unions. The unions are too weak. Now, the second part of my talk is as follows. I want to make the argument that unions are actually a stabilizing force for capitalism. I don't know what your stance vis-à-vis capitalism is, but unions are one of those institutions that contribute to make a fundamentally unstable system like capitalism relatively more stable for some time. So unions are a stabilizing force for capitalism, in particular for a type of capitalism that I will call Fordist or wage-led capitalism, and that the decline of unions is one of the factors that explains the increasing capitalist instability that we observe. Let me start with some data. These are difficult to read, but these are data on union density in several advanced countries: Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, UK, and USA, from 1974 until the early crisis years, 2011. And these are the percentage changes. I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but if you look at these columns that tell you, have unions become stronger or weaker, you will find that they have become weaker everywhere. I mean, the decline starts at different points in time. For some time, it looked as though the Scandinavian countries were not experiencing decline. Then they started again, and now they are experiencing decline. Overall, all these numbers are negative. The one thing that I want to show you is that once upon a time we used to think that, well, only the Anglo-Saxon, the so-called liberal market economies, would deregulate their labor markets, whereas the coordinated market economies like Germany would not. If you look at those numbers, the decline in Germany is actually higher than the decline in the US, and especially in the UK. So unions are in crisis everywhere. That's the point I want to make. Perhaps with the exception of Belgium, we can discuss that, why that's the case. There are very specific institutional reasons why Belgium seems to be safe until the crisis. And this is collective bargaining. This is collective bargaining centralization. This is an index of collective bargaining that takes a growing value depending on how centralized bargaining is. One means that bargaining either does not exist and all wage contracts are done on an individualized basis, the worker with the company, or if there is bargaining, it is at the plant level. And this would be the situation of the US. And then the maximum is a situation where bargaining is entirely centralized. All wages are being negotiated at the top country level for all sectors. And that used to be the case for the Nordic countries. Denmark and Finland have a 6. Sweden used to have a 6 in the early 70s. Now, these numbers tend to be highly inertial. They don't change. If you look at the measure of how centralized bargaining is in Germany, it looks as though things have not changed much. But they are adjusted in this case by the prevalence of opening clauses. So an opening clause means that even when bargaining is centralized, there are clauses negotiated by lower level unions and firms to derogate from the provisions of higher level bargaining. And if you make this adjustment, you again see a dramatic decline. Again, with one exception, which is Belgium. Everywhere else, you have a dramatic decline. So the index of bargaining centralization in Germany declines by 33% between 1989 and 2011. It declines by 75% in Ireland. It declines by almost 50% in Australia. Where you don't see a decline in the US and in the UK, it's because bargaining was never centralized to begin with, so there was no change. So unions are becoming much weaker over time everywhere, and bargaining is becoming much less centralized than it used to be. Why is this a problem? Not just for workers. Why is this a problem for capitalism? Because these two institutions, unions and multi-employer bargaining, used to be the key institution of the so-called Fordist wage-led growth model. This Fordist wage-led growth model was a model in which income increases because real wages increase. And real wage increase because they are linked to productivity, not by the spontaneous mechanisms of the market, but by an institutional mechanism. There are unions that make sure that when productivity increases get produced, they are transferred into workers' real wages. If they are not transferred in workers' real wages, guess where they go? Profits, in the profit share. So there was this institution that contributed, as I will show, to stabilize the system. Now, the system was also stabilized by other things. This is a pre-globalization type of capitalism. So there is no capital mobility, there are capital controls, and trade is not as open as it is now. But most importantly, capital cannot move freely across borders. And the institution of a Fordist system was an institutionalized pact between labor and capital, whereby capital recognizes the legitimacy of labor. Labor becomes a social partner rather than an enemy, and labor gives up on the perspective of fundamental transformation, the socialization of the means of production, in exchange for distribution of productivity gains. Now, there was differentiation across countries. Not all countries were the same, and the main axis of differentiation was how stable and institutionalized this pact, which is. This producer pact. This pact was either absent or highly unstable in the so-called problem countries, Italy and the UK. There was social conflict. What was the most important manifestation of social conflict? High inflation. It was present and effective in the so-called corporatist countries, Austria, Sweden, and then Germany was in some sort of intermediary position because there was never formalized centralization, but labor was brought in at the industry and enterprise level. In highly stylized form, the Fordist wage-led growth model had this kind of cycle here. There were productivity increases. They would be transferred to wage increases. So real wages would grow through productivity. Real wage growth would feed into mostly domestic demand, and domestic demand would then generate productivity increases through various mechanisms, the most important of which is the so-called Kaldorfer-Dorn law, that if demand expands and is expected to expand, then firms want to invest more. Or if demand expands, then you can have economies of scale. Now you can see that there is a double arrow there. Productivity feeds into wage increases, but wage increases feed into productivity. One thing that I want to emphasize before I move on is that this transfer of productivity gains into wage increases, which according to the neoclassical growth model happens spontaneously. It's the market that, at full employment transfers productivity into wages. The wage is equal to the marginal productivity of the worker. This transfer doesn't happen spontaneously. It is mediated by an institution. There are unions through bargaining which index real wage growth to productivity growth. Now, let me explain a little bit this double arrow, this effect of wages on productivity. This is what my predecessor at the Max Planck Institute, Wolfgang Street, calls beneficial constraints. So, rigidities, rather than being detrimental to efficiency, they actually contribute to efficiency. How? Some of these mechanisms I have already mentioned. Wage cost increases instigate a mechanism of capital-labor substitution. Labor becomes more expensive relative to capital, and so firms have an incentive to replace capital, labor with capital, and that leads to a productivity increase. Wage cost increases generate incentives for rationalization and diversification. This was the story of the German manufacturing system in the 1980s. An industry that had higher costs and higher rigidities than its main international competitors, which, notwithstanding all its problems, became more efficient than international competitors exactly because it had rigidities that prevented it from going the low road, from competing on costs. And then there are other mechanisms. Demand expansions leads to economies of scale, which generate productivity increases, and demand expansion leads to the stimulation of investments. Now, I don't want to glorify the Fordist wage-led growth model. It has lots of problems. The main problems that it had was in the gender division of labor. This was a model in which male workers did much better than female workers. This was a model which was centered on the male breadwinner. And it was expected that the woman would be the angel of the house, as the expression went, and deal with care work, and care work was unpaid. Aside from that, and it's a big aside, and aside from possible negative environmental consequences of this highly resource-intensive growth model, this was a model that generated the highest growth rates that we have seen. This is the model of the 30 Glorieuses, of the 30 years after 1945, and also the most equitable distribution of income. So it's not by no means perfect, but it was pretty effective. But it's a thing of the past. The wage-led growth model entered into a crisis which was due both to external changes and internal endogenous dynamics. The external changes can be summarized as globalization. The first big change was the liberalization of capital accounts. Capital mobility means that now firms cannot pay a rate of return which is lower than the international rate of return. And if the international rate of return, which is determined by the interest rate policy of the Fed, is higher, rate of returns have to go up everywhere else. The second change is trade liberalization. In the wage-led growth model, low wages are a problem. They lead to stagnation because they reduce domestic demand. But if the economy is sufficiently open, if it relies sufficiently heavily on exports, then low wages, wage moderation, become a positive factor for growth. because they increase the competitiveness of domestic firms relative to foreign firms. These were the two external factors. The internal factor, the most important one, was that the wage-led growth model had an inflationary bias, tended to generate high inflation. And this unleashed a policy backlash by public policy makers, which started, as is well known, in the UK with Thatcher in 1979 and Reagan in 1981, and then in creeping form spread to all other countries. One of the manifestations of the policy backlash was a generalized trend towards the liberalization of industrial relations institutions. Again, let's look at this in terms of wage shares. And we're going to focus on 4 countries: Germany, Italy, Sweden, and the UK. These are the 4 countries that I'm currently focusing on for my research. Now, the wage share is important because it can be reformulated as real unit labor costs. It tells you whether the real wages grows at the same rate as productivity. If the real wage grows more slowly than productivity, the wage share will go down. Vice versa, if it grows faster than productivity. This is Germany. You see that the wage share increases in the 60s and in the 70s, peaks sometimes in the 70s, and then starts declining. And it declines pretty dramatically in the early 2000s. And then it seems to plateau. Similar shape, Italy, again, an increase in the 60s and 70s. The wage share is increasing. Workers' real wages are growing faster than labor productivity. Then a decline, and then a clearer pickup again of the wage share. And I'll tell you what is causing this increase again of the wage share. The wage share in Sweden actually declines less than in the other 2 countries. And again, picks up in the 2000s. In the UK, it decreases even less, which is really surprising because the UK is supposed to be a more deregulated labor market. So there is a generalized decline of the wage share. And simultaneously, almost at the same time, there is a generalized liberalization of industrial relations. Now, I've written a book about this, and I will only say 3 sentences. But one thing that I want to say is that liberalization of industrial relations is a general phenomenon. I mean, part of the literature says you have to distinguish between labor market economies and coordinated market economies. This is the so-called varieties of capitalism literature. The Anglo-Saxon countries are liberalizing, whereas Germany and Japan are not. That's wrong. All of these countries are liberalizing, including Germany, and perhaps Germany more than others. So it's a common trajectory which is not easily visible when you focus on the form of institutions. Collective bargaining remains centralized in some countries, for example in Italy, but now generates very different outcomes from the past. It's a trajectory which is more perceptible when you look at outcomes. And one thing that all these countries have in common is a generalized increase in employment discretion, in employer discretion. The employer used to be more constrained in what it could do, and now it's much freer to hire and fire, to pay according to market, to deploy labor across workplaces. Now, deregulation per se, a frontal attack on institutions, the dismantling of institutions is a rare occurrence. You rarely find a government going head-on against the unions. The one example that I know of is Thatcherite Britain. Perhaps Macron's France now, if he succeeds. But this is a really rare event. More common is a slow incremental transition, what I call institutional conversion. You leave the form of institution the same. Industry-level bargaining is still the predominant form in Germany, but it works very differently now from the past.
Sorry to just interrupt, but what's about the coverage?
Yes, the coverage is going down. It's going down dramatically. Yes, but absolutely, it went down from in the manufacturing sector from 80% below to 50%.
If you have an institution which doesn't cover the employees, then it's not very effective.
Right, but still, the main form of bargaining in Germany is industry-level bargaining.
Yes, yeah. When only 40-50% of people are covered.
Absolutely, yeah. I can give you another example. So in Italy, just to make the point that I want to make, in Italy, collective bargaining used to be decentralized. It was decentralized in the 70s when the unions were at their strongest. In the 90s, it was heavily centralized, so in the 90s, Italy was doing corporatist bargaining. What was the unions negotiating at the top level? They were negotiating concessions. They were negotiating pension reform. They were negotiating labor market reform. They were negotiating incomes policies. This is what I mean. So if you just look at the form of institution and say, look, Italy went from decentralized bargaining to centralized bargaining. Baccaro, how can you talk about liberalization? And then I look at what the unions were doing, and in the 1970s, they were like negotiating in the vanguard firms, the firms where the workers were strongest, and then they would using industry-level bargaining to spread the gains to weaker firms, and now they're negotiating at the top pension reforms, reduction in pension benefits, increase in retirement age, and so on and so forth. This is the point I want to make. But you're absolutely right that the German case is a case of slow weakening of the coverage of existing institutions. It's not just collective bargaining coverage. So collective bargaining coverage goes down, but now a big chunk of those firms that are covered by an industry-level collective bargaining agreements have opening clauses, which means that if there is a crisis, you're going to have lower contractual conditions than the industry level implies.
So you should separate between implementation and discussion.
Sorry?
Discussion afterwards. I think we should keep to this formula.
No. What did I didn't understand. What was your point? No, of course it's not. It's not a force of nature. I'm just making the point that, and I haven't made the point yet. I'm just saying that unions, industrial relations institutions are being weakened everywhere in different forms.
Yes, but by forcing the tensions like labor market forces from states, yes, but it's also not just the thing that happens that we mentioned.
No, it's not just firms. Although in Germany it's mostly firms, but it's also governments. So this was the second point I was going to make. The liberalization of industrial relations is brought about by both organized employers and the state. And there are no major differences between governments of the left or the right. They're pretty much doing the same thing when it comes to labor market policy. In all cases, what I have called a key institutions for this capitalism, multi-employer bargaining, is weakened or undermined. And this is a problem because if these economies are wage-led, and if the institutions that ensure the transition of productivity increases into wages becomes weaker, then you're going to have a potential problem of insufficient aggregate demand. So there is a tendency for demand stagnation in wage-led economies. which means that growth in all these countries slows down, which is what happens. And there is a problem of too much income going to groups, capital in particular, that spends that income not so much to purchase goods and services, but to purchase financial assets, i.e., this is the consequence of the increase in the capital share. A bigger chunk of the income feeds into the financial circle. Advanced economies tackled this problem of potentially insufficient aggregate demand in essentially two ways. The countries that address the problem successfully, some countries don't address the problem at all, so they just stagnate. On the one hand, they stimulate domestic demand, which remains the main driver of growth, through an easier access to credit. So real wages have become stagnant, but consumption can increase because households can have easier access to debt, to banking credit. This is the so-called debt and consumption-led growth model. Think of the UK before the crisis. And then the other solution is replacing internal demand with external demand. And that's the so-called export-led growth model. And you can guess which country has been especially successful at solving the problem of aggregate demand in this way. To cut a long story short, these two alternatives to wage-led growth, which was fairly stable, had an institutional mechanism that stabilized it. There was multi-employer collective bargaining. These two responses are complementary through the current account. The consumption and debt-led growth models tend to accumulate external debts, whereas the export-led countries tend to accumulate external credits. And of course, you can go into debt only if somebody is willing to lend to you. And you can accumulate credits only if somebody is willing to take your money. So they are complementary, but they are both unstable, highly unstable, in very different ways. The debt-led growth model, we've seen why it's unstable, because it rides bubbles. The latest bubble is the housing bubble. These bubbles then explode, so housing prices are boosted up by higher levels of debt of households. At some point, the bubble bursts, and the economy gets into a long and very painful recession. And the export-led growth model is also very unstable, because if everybody wants to be an export-led growth model, nobody can be an export-led growth model. It's only successful if it's an exception. If it's not an exception, if everybody tries to steal demand from others by reducing its internal standards, everybody will have lower standards. A classic collective action problem. Now, one thing that these two post-Fordist growth models have in common is that for both growth models, unions and collective bargaining are no longer the key institution. They have a marginal role in both cases. So overall, let me summarize this part. Unions. So first I told you that there is no clear evidence that unions are bad, and some evidence that they are good. Now I've added another element. Unions were a key ingredient for capitalist stability in the Fordist era. They provided a mechanism by which productivity increases fed into real wages and domestic demand, and the decline of unions seems to have contributed to greater capitalist instability across advanced countries. Now, let me conclude with some brief considerations about if unions are so important, can they be strengthened? How can they go back to where they were? So one thing that I want to get rid of immediately is the so-called, it's the union's fault. Unions have been too complacent, too lazy, too concerned with insiders. They should adopt different strategies. Now, there is a very large literature out there called union revitalization literature, mostly Anglo-Saxon, focused on the British and the American case, that says unions should invest heavily in organizing new workers. These new workers have to be young, precarious, and employed in the service sector. All of this is very good. But there's one thing that needs to be said. It's not the union's fault. It's not a problem of strategy. I've showed you the data for all these countries. I could show you more data for developing countries. I don't know of a single country in which unions have become stronger. I don't know of a single country in which, because they adopted innovative strategy, unions have become more representative than in the past. This is a structural problem that cuts across several countries. By sheer statistics, if this was a problem of strategy, 5 out of 100 would get the strategy right. You would see 5 national union movements that are growing out of 100. I don't know them. I only know one, which is the Chinese labor movement, and I think that those statistics are fake because there is no freedom of association in that country. So it's a structural problem. It's not a problem of adopting the right strategies. What should happen is that union strength should be recognized, acknowledged, and promoted by the state. The state should acknowledge that unions have positive externalities, that they stabilize the capitalist system in various ways, and provide institutional incentives and protections just like they did in the 70s and in the 80s. Then perhaps we can discuss concretely what protections means. Can this be done? I mean, suppose that we find a state, suppose that there is a change, a political change in a country. Can a country alone change things? Very difficult. There is a collective action problem. Take one country, and again, I don't want to, I'll make names. Take Italy. Suppose there is a dramatic political change in Italy. There's a new government that wants to come up with a completely different labor market policy strategy and wants to make unions stronger. What do you think is the first thing that happens in that country? Capital flight, spread, interest rates increasing, i.e. the government is forced back to where it was. So this is very difficult to achieve in a single country context. It would require deep reform of European governance institutions. For example, the introduction of coordinated bargaining at the European level, whereby wages have to be on average equal to labor productivity plus the inflation target of the European Central Bank. And in general, making unions stronger requires as a precondition increasing the policy discretion of national policymakers, giving back some of the discretion that states have lost. But that is a very big, vast program, as somebody said. It's a very big program, and it would require rethinking and perhaps fundamentally changing some of the policies that underpin the current international globalization model. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Okay. Thank you very much for having me tonight. I have to admit, when Professor Baccaro sent me his presentation at the weekend, I was a bit puzzled. Not puzzled in a negative sense, but puzzled in a positive sense, because I thought it, and he confirmed it tonight, that it looked to me like a very interesting presentation. And I had to, when I read it through it, I agreed with nearly all that he said on his sheets and what he presented tonight. But I asked myself, what's left for me? Thus, why am I here tonight? What can I contribute in addition to the facts and the arguments he presented? So I felt a bit like Pooh Bear and Piglet, and had to come up with a solution to that. So I want to make tonight two minor contributions to this interesting topic. My first contribution is to support and strengthen Professor Baccaro's arguments with the help of what is termed nowadays modern labor economics. And finally, also, given that we want to discuss a bit, I want to disagree with his negative assessment of the possibility of a union renaissance in a single country. And I have to admit, with this single country, I had to think a bit, or in my mind, I had Germany. So that are the two contributions I try to make in the following. And I want to start my contribution with the title of a very interesting paper which came out in 2007. And it was called Monopsony as a Metaphor for the Emerging Post-Union Labor Market. And it is very close to actually what Professor Baccaro presented in his lecture or in his presentation tonight. Because if you listen to Milton Friedman, then you saw the typical arguments economists brought for a long time with respect to trade unions and in general a presentation how they thought that economies work. The idea was always that in an ideal world, in paradise, if you leave the economy on its own, it would work perfectly well. Everyone would be happy, everyone would be free to choose, and we would maximize everyone's profit, utility, whatever the economists like to maximize. However, unfortunately, reality was imperfect, and human beings created all kind of restrictions, frictions, which prevented this paradise called perfect competition to work properly and prevented actually human mankind in economic terms from happiness. However, nowadays, even in mainstream economics, so even in neoclassical economics, this worldview has quite changed. However, often not recognized necessarily in public and in other social sciences. And I'm not one of the authors of this book, but this is the book I now, and I don't get any advertisement money, but this is the book I use nowadays, teaching at university, a labor economics course, and I think it's a brilliant book, so if one is interested to buy one labor economics book, I always advise him or her to buy this book. It's called The Economics of Imperfect Labor Markets. Yeah? So we are studying not perfect labor markets anymore, we are studying imperfect labor markets. And why do we do that? Because they are we think nowadays they are much more realistic, and there are reasons why they are imperfect. And I want to go into these reasons a bit. And actually, given that I said it's modern labor market, it's quite interesting that you could argue it's not that modern, because I found quite a while ago a quote from the father of economics, Adam Smith, on market power in the labor market. And I mean, it's quite a long quote. But what does he say? He said, very much he says, well, that wages depend not only on workers, wages depend on two parties. In his days, these two parties were actually the workmen, yeah, and the masters. He called them in 1776 when his book came out. And of course, they have completely different agreements. That's what the quote says. Actually, workers want high wages and masters want low wages. And interestingly, at that stage, he already, when he analyzed the situation, he said, well, in his opinion, it's quite clear if there is a struggle about wages, who will come out on top. And not like Milton Friedman was thinking, it was not the workers who come up on top, it were the masters. Why were it the masters? Because he said, well, in contrast to the workmen, the masters have resources. They can sustain a struggle about higher wages. They have a lot of resources, power, actually, to the higher bargaining power, we would call that nowadays, to end up actually to win these wage struggles. Now that was in 1776. Then something happened in economics and we forgot it for quite a while. If you look then at the literature, then because you see that there are countless publications in economics have dealt with the market power of workers. There's a huge literature on trade unions, at least up to the end of the 1990s. The Professor Baccaro presented his arguments. On the other hand, there was not much literature on the market power of employers in economics. So you could say there was an ideological bias in terms of research. It has long been neglected by economists as a research topic, and it was said it's a special case, which sometimes, if you were lucky, was taught in microeconomics courses, but most often due to time constraints it was left out. It was called the case of monopsony. And what I did quickly today, so if someone wants to check it, maybe I got the numbers slightly wrong, but this is a picture. I did a Google Scholar search on two terms. One term was the monopsony term, which is an economic expression for a labor market model where employers have market power. And interestingly, as you can see, from 1986 to 2002, there were 9,700 results on this term. And in the same time span from 2003 to 2019, and I choose 2003 because an interesting book came out by that, which was called Monopsony in Motion by a British labor economist called Alan Manning. You see that in the second time span, the term monopsony, as you can find it on Google Scholar, doubled. And if you look at imperfect labor market, at the term imperfect labor market, and I choose the American as well as the English spelling, you see also a huge increase in these terms, indicating that there was a change how labor economists started to look at the economy. And a lot of these arguments which were presented, or which are still used in politics, and which Professor Baccaro actually showed that they have no empirical evidence, or not very good empirical evidence, were based on this old labor economics, or this old economics in general, and not on this new imperfect labor market economics. And the interesting question, that's where I wanted to continue, was actually, and I was inspired from this, what Milton Friedman said. Milton Friedman was very clear that there was this imperfect world with this, unfortunately, there were trade unions and there were other imperfections, but he said, well, if you could move to perfect competition, everything would be fine. But what is if these labor markets without trade unions are not really paradise? What if they are not perfectly competitive, but if they are monopsonistic? So that means if these labor markets are suddenly markets where employers have market power and are the dominant force in the labor market, what are the results of this? Given to the time constraints I have, the monopsony idea is very similar to the idea of a monopoly where you have one supplier of a good, but now you only, in the artificial textbook case, you had initially only one one employer who was demanding labor. Nowadays we have more modern models of monopsonistic labor markets where we talk about monopsonistic and oligopsonistic competition. So where we have showed that there are a lot of sources which actually make labor markets or form labor markets in such a way that employers actually have market power. And if anyone was ever interested in the history of the labor movements internationally, then this is not very surprising, because labor trade unions and labor parties, they came not from heaven by accident. They were most often the result that workers were the weak ones when they were confronted with employers. Think of Manchester capitalism, think about the writings of Marx and Engels, and they formed coalitions, to get stronger, to get in a better bargaining positions against strong employers. And that's what modern labor economics finally is recognizing. And the interesting bit, and that's also what the empirics show, that if employers have market power, then they can pay lower wages, than the competitive wage, and they are not losing their workers. So this idea that workers are free to choose then a better employer doesn't work like that. They can redistribute part of the revenue away from wages to profits. That's you can see then in the aggregate, in the macro level, in falling wage shares, for example, through a less aggressive way of filling vacancies, lower pay and lower employment levels. And I mean, economists, we like graphs. At the end, we try to make it simple. But it's never that simple, so we like always to have a demand and supply. And the curve with the W is very much the supply curve of labor. And the MRPL, that's the labor demand curve. And ideally, in the perfect competitive world of Milton Friedman, labor market outcome would be that what is called perfect competition, where supply equals demand. And in the hellish world of trade unions, that was where he said, well, where wages were high for some and unemployment and employment was low, was actually, well, this forceful monopoly union chooses the high wage, exploits all the rents, and that would be for economists the point where the marginal cost curve, MW, actually crosses this labor demand curve. However, if Erickson and Mitchell are right, and we are talking about markets in which trade unions do not exist anymore, we might end up in this third case, which Friedman was never interested to look. We might end up in a monopsonistic labor market. And there you could see that employment is as low as in a monopolistic trade union labor market model, but wages are much lower. And this model, as I showed in the simple case, is very much the theoretical argument why in Germany, for example, we introduced a minimum wage in 2015. This was the theoretical argument which was supported empirically, that you could introduce actually a minimum wage which is beneficial for workers without necessarily causing unemployment or being useless. So the question is really, and I think Professor Baccaro's empirical evidence points very much that by weakening trade unions and the trade union movement and all the institutions of the Fordist wage-led growth model, we did not really move from this trade union equilibrium to a perfect competitive equilibrium. I think there's a lot of evidence which points very much that we are moving towards this equilibrium which is better described by a monopsonistic world where employers are the dominant force, they have the market power, and with all the consequences which he pointed out. What are these consequences? And they are actually summarized not by me, but so also that for you to interest maybe to look. This is from the Council of Economic Advisors of Barack Obama, 2016. It might be under President Trump, you might not find it on the webpage anymore. But they published a report, Labor Market Monopsony, Trends, Consequences and Policy Responses. And they said, what are the consequences of this monopsonistic labor market or markets? There's a redistribution from wage to profit income. That's what we are seeing in the data. Yeah? There are inefficiently low employment and production levels. Yeah? So we could be better if we would reduce this market power of employers. There's a weakened relationship between labor productivity and wages. That's what we also see in the data with the falling wage share. And there are wage differentials within and between firms as a result of limited competition on the employer side. So we see large size effects. We see discrimination between female and male workers, which we can explain with such monopsonistic structures. And we see wage discrimination within one's own employment or wage discrimination through the fissuring of the workplace. And a phenomena observed in the US where you can see that labor markets are fissured for the benefit of the employers and for the detriment of workers. And they are fostering wage inequality. So this is, let's say, the idea of providing a micro foundation, that's what economists like, to this macro story of Professor Baccaro. However, where I wanted to disagree was finally on the question, is union renaissance possible in a single country? Even though I think his arguments are quite convincing, I nevertheless try to disagree. If we look at the German system of collective bargaining, which he stressed, then in Germany the importance of industry-wide collective bargaining he showed is in significant decline. Some would even say dramatic of my colleagues. However, what is also important, that the importance of the industry-wide collective bargaining in Germany was never only the consequence of the strength of the trade unions. The specificity of the German model was always that it was relying to a remarkable part on the employer's capacity to organize. So the very high share of employers being members of employers' organization for a long time was the main contribution why collective bargaining had a huge coverage, or had a high coverage rate in Germany, because union density, as we saw in Professor Baccaro's tables, was in Germany never that exceptionally high compared. It was not higher than, for example, in the UK, and it was much lower than the Scandinavian countries or Austria. And I think if in the strongest economy and in the largest economy in the European Union, if there is sufficient political will, then I think there is a possibility to change the political framework in such a way that the system of industry-wide collective bargaining and the role of trade unions in Germany could be strengthened, without necessarily the problems of capital flight and so on. Of course, the question is always how you implement it. However, even if interest rates would go up a bit in Germany at the moment, it wouldn't be a big problem for us in terms of capital flight, so I don't think that. However, the government would have to recognize that a minimum wage is not sufficient to make sure that the system of collective agreements in Germany will survive. A minimum wage nowadays is necessary, but the minimum wage only guarantees a lower level, for the wage distribution. Only collective agreements at the end will make sure that you can influence the distribution of wages. And I think one of the most important policy measures would be to supplement the minimum wage, which was introduced, with a reform which would make it easier to extend collective agreements to cover all employment in a sector of, in Deutsch, allgemeinverbindliche Erklärung. Yeah? We would have to make it easier for the government to make collective agreements to cover all employment in a given industry sector. There are proposals who suggest how this could be done. So far, the only thing which is lacking was the political will or the political strength to attempt that. But I think if Germany would try to start it, that could be a signal that we could see a change, that we could see an improvement on the strength of the system of collective bargaining in Germany. And if in Germany it would be possible, I think this would be important signals for countries like Italy and others, where we could see that improvements. I think it is possible, it would be worthwhile. Whether we see it with this actual coalition, I'm not sure. Thank you very much.